Model railroads have been with us since, well, nearly the beginning of railroads. Today we visit one man, Charlie Burns. He's building a model rail of the line between San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara, dubbed the South End, long considered among the most picturesque in the Southern Pacific rail system. It was the very last to be completed, connecting San Francisco and Los Angeles. Perhaps because of this ruggedness and remoteness, the landscape is still recognizable as it was in 1901, over 100 years ago when the line was completed. With timetable in hand, Charlie hopes to have his South End model, as it was operating in 1964, one of the busiest times for rail service along the Central Coast. First, a little historic background. A rail line between San Francisco and Los Angeles was envisioned even before California's statehood. In 1854, surveyors mapped out the rail route following this trail established in the late 1700s for the California Mission. By 1869, when the first transcontinental railroad met at Promontory Point, Utah, rail service was already operating between San Francisco and San Jose. And in just a few years later, the rail service extended to Salinas and Soledad, San Jose. It took 20 years before the rail line reached Santa Margarita from the Bay Area. Then stagecoaches and buggies met the train at the small depot in Santa Margarita to take passengers and cargo over the Cuesta Grade to San Luis Obispo. From San Luis Obispo, a narrow-gauge Pacific Coast Railroad provided rail service to as far as Los Olivos, where stagecoaches provided transportation to Santa Barbara. Mountain range was a major obstacle that separated San Luis Obispo from cities to the north. Trains traveled best on level ground. Any grade more than 2% are difficult for trains to manage in comparison with today's autos and trucks, which can handle up to about a 7% grade. The cost of the rail line over the Cuesta Grade was estimated to be $3 million, or $300,000 a mile. Certainly a tremendous sum in the late 1800s. In fact, an alternative route was considered that would have avoided the mountain range but leave out direct service to San Luis Obispo. At the insistence of railroad builders, the good citizens of San Luis Obispo come up with the necessary financial incentive to complete the task. The technology at that time relying on workers using hand picks and shovels. Most of that work was done by imported Chinese laborers. In turn, San Luis Obispo's Chinatown came into being in the late 1880s. Direct rail service reached San Luis Obispo in 1894. Besides the grading, 7 tunnels, a steel viaduct over Stenner Creek, and extended switchback loops had to be built. The famous switchback loop was Horseshoe Bend, whereby riders in the front of the train can actually see the back end of the same train as it curves around the loop. Even with extensive construction, trains often required helper engines to cross the Cuesta grade. Once real service arrived into San Luis Obispo, the line quickly extended down to the rich farming lands in Guadalupe and Santa Maria. The rail service was able to tap a variety of products such as sugar beets and diatomaceous earth used in ceramics, toothpaste, and mild abrasive detergent. By 1896, a new depot was built at an isolated spot 14 miles west of the thriving agricultural community of Lompoc. Surf Depot was envisioned to be the start of a lucrative seaside resort town. Unfortunately, it never was realized due to the expanding military base, now known as Vandenberg, discouraged any civilian development. Rail service from Los Angeles reached Santa Barbara in 1887. And shortly extended 11 miles north to Elwood, just 57 miles short of Surf. A decade later, in 1900, the final spike was driven at the Cementerio Bridge trestle, just 23 miles north of Santa Barbara. That very same evening, the first train crossed the trestle, and in the following year, direct scheduled coastline train service between San Francisco and Los Angeles was in full operation. After various improvements and realignments, the current configuration was finished in 1910. From the start, the coastline was heavily promoted. The Pismo Bluffs was often touted in travel promotions. Railroad aficionados are passionate about their history. Charlie is no exception.
popular era to model is steam engines by 1955. But for me, 1964 is easier to model for the same reason the railroads abandoned steam engines for diesels. Diesels are easier to maintain. That's the sets and things on them that have to be balanced, and that's just more moving parts that have to be fixed. And they were right between two generations of diesels. They had early diesels that they had bought in the 40s and 50s that were being supplanted by early 1960s turbocharged, what were called second generation diesels. There were two different paint schemes on the engines because they were going from in 1959. And freight cars were the same way. You still had a lot of old equipment that went back to the 1930s. Still cars that were constructed completely out of wood, and yet you had ultra modern cars that were longer and held more stuff. They hauled the most traffic. It was a traffic peak for the railroad, only surpassed by World War II, which is another popular era for people to model, because in World War II they ran a lot more equipment. But I run all the equipment, and I'm planning to run every single train that ran through here in 1964, including all 6 passenger trains. There were 17 scheduled movements, and they're all represented on cards for different trains that are run through here. Some of the trains run through twice, some of my trains. And although the timetable does show a movement for a particular train, that could be more than one train, which is something else I'm researching. Some of the local trains ran in 2 or 3 sections, which means 2 or 3 different trains came through, and they'd all follow each other and run as different pieces of it, because the train was too long to run in one piece. They'd get up to Santa Barbara, and they'd split the train in 2. The coastline is actually a mountain railroad. It runs up and down the hills as it goes up and down up the coast. They had to cut the trains down a little bit. They'd have a train that maybe had 150 cars, and they'd cut it into 75-car trains, but they'd run that as the same train. They'd have engines assigned as a second section of it. Trains going the other way couldn't get between those 2 sections, so if a train was waiting on the siding for 2 sections of a train, both sections had to come by before it could run the other way. Complicated things for the real railroad, but all that stuff just makes it more fun for the model. More complications, switching of cars, scheduling things that would be a nightmare for the real railroad are all more fun for somebody operating a model railroad. There aren't many people modeling it, like the coastline part, because it's not very accessible. In '64 is easier for me to model, and I was around in 1964. So I remember it. I don't remember World War II because I wasn't there, although I could probably research it. And the thing about this line is most of the stuff looked exactly the same back then. The scenery was exactly the same. It's the same now. You go out to Gaviota, and it's still the trestle, it's still the beach, it's the same as you look at a picture of it from 1937 on, the trestle is exactly the same. My model of the coastline is equipped to operate